Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. And in this video, we're going to continue looking at the transition to the modern world, but we're going to look at a different region. We're going to focus mainly on Israel and the Middle East. But I can tell you straight up, the main focus here is going to be on Israel, which is still extremely newsworthy today. You see it in the news all the time. So let's start with pretty much the creation of the state, or maybe it looks like even before that, and then we're going to move on to what's happening today in the region. So Zionism is the call for a new state for Jews. All right, so this word Zion has to do with or relates to Jews. Zionism is a movement for almost like a Jewish nationalism is a good way of thinking about it. And the Jews, they've not had a country since being dispersed in the diaspora by the Romans in the year 70 AD. We mentioned this a little bit in a previous video recently when we were talking about the Holocaust. And so, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, before World War before World War II, an influx of Zionists or Jews that were searching for a Jewish homeland migrated to the geographic region known as Palestine, which is what this is right here. If you read the Bible, historically this region is known as Palestine. It's known as Canaan. It's known as Judea and Judah. We're all still talking about basically the area where the Jews lived historically prior to 70 AD, where the temple and all that is. All right. So in 1947, the United Nations voted. Now this is only 2 years after World War II ended. Okay. So the United Nations voted to partition the region into a Jewish and Palestinian state. All right, so a place with autonomy and a government and people to live there. But and many Palestinian Muslims lived in the area of Palestine. There were people living there already, and they like I said, they belonged to the Ottoman Empire at the time, but they were very rooted territorially and geographically. And Islam has kind of been a thing in this region, for a huge amount of time since the Jews had left, or since they were kicked out by the Romans. And so the issue here is, in order to partition the land and allow the Jews to have homeland in that, or I guess a homeland in that territory, they've got to kick the Palestinians who live there out. Who would have ever thought that something that happened in 70 AD, picking up the pieces of that, more or less, would cause one of the biggest political squabbles in modern times? But what happens is Israel got most of the land that was partitioned, but only had 34% of the region's population. And so part of this was certainly sympathy due to the Holocaust that occurred during World War II. But the Muslim countries saw it as absolutely outrageous that the UN would do this despite the minority Jewish population. They felt like the largest chunk of the land should have gone to the Palestinians. And so what they did, and by the way, they all voted against the partition in the United Nations, but it was still have a majority. So the 6 neighboring countries around Israel, the day after it was proclaimed a state, they attacked Israel. And these 6 countries were Egypt, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. And so they launched a coalition offensive against the new Jewish country. And this one here was the first of several wars that took place over the issue. Because of the conflict, the Palestinian state never really came to fruition. In 1967, the Six-Day War had occurred, where Egypt, who had weapons provided to them by the USSR, felt like they had the capacity to beat the Jews in a military conflict, and so they challenged Israel. Israel destroyed their airfields and then attacked them and their allies on 3 different fronts, and overwhelmed their enemy on all 3 of those fronts very, very quickly, almost like a blitzkrieg kind of thing. And so the result of that is, if you look here, this is territory that was controlled after 1967 to 1982. That's basically everything here would become more or less the territory of Israel. So they went from basically being this right there to everything else that you see here on this map after the 6-Day War. So Israel's territory grew substantially. Egypt, later on, under President Anwar Sadat, decided that they were going to offer peace to Israel in exchange for the return of the territory that they gained. And Israel, met with Egypt's president, Mr. Sadat, at Camp David. The Camp David Accords, mediated by Jimmy Carter, was signed, and this did create a historic peace between Israel and Egypt, and it was the first time that Israel was recognized by a Muslim country. But it didn't solve the problem by any stretch, because there still is no Palestinian state, and there's still the issue with the Palestinians that had to up and move. And so Israel and Palestinian Muslims today are still having issues over who gets what, and it's a real mess. And there's no easy answer to it, but here's kind of the skinny on what's going on. There's still no Palestinian state, right? And Jerusalem, which is said to be split between the Palestinians and the Israelis, is still very much a disputed thing. And so you can see this big wall here that kind of divides the Israeli-owned Jerusalem from the West Bank, where the Palestinians live. And you can see kind of the disparity between the two, or between the two sides here. And Israel feels like, this is their historic religious capital. They feel very entitled to the whole thing, and Muslims who have lived there for the last 2,000 years also, I guess, last, say, not 2,000, about 1,500 years, have also felt very, very strongly tied and connected to it. After all, Jerusalem is the third holiest site in all of Islam. And so they all feel like they should get the whole piece of the pie. Several peace talks have failed to produce any results between the two, and today Israelis have begun building and selling settlements to Israelis in the West Bank, which was land that everyone knows was promised to Palestinians. And so, in doing so, what's going to happen is they're trying to solidify their control of that territory, because to give it to Palestinians at a later date will mean they will have to move those Israelis who have come in and paid this good money to modernize and to settle here in these areas, which are really well-to-do areas here. They would have to undo all that in order to give it now to the Palestinians. So they're trying to, I guess, put their stake in the ground here on territory that is technically promised to Palestinians. And also, to kind of exasperate this situation more recently, President Trump has moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, which is really kind of going to serve as a United States recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, and therefore an Israeli possession. Now, many other presidents have talked about doing this in the past, but the fact that Trump has done it kind of does, like I said, solidify that, I guess, established feeling. And so, who gets the short end of the stick, who deserves Jerusalem, who deserves Israel, I'll leave that up for your interpretation. I suggest you watch the news and you'll see way more on exactly what it is that I am talking about. And by the way, just to kind of finish up with this video here, this is a map of Jerusalem, and you can see this is the West Bank. Okay, here's Israel as a whole, and these right here are the different settlements that are being built in this area that is supposed to be designated for the Palestinians. So, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.